like to present the recent Baker Island expedition. Don.
Thank you. We'll start with a little video James Brooks did on the expedition. That's it. Any questions? So Baker Island. 3 years ago, we applied for a permit. It took that long to get permission. Why Baker Island? It's rare. There have only been 3 expeditions of any size to it. The last one, of course, was K1B, which had the luxury of going there at the top of a cycle. We did not. And after Kosovo was added to the list, KH1 was number 6. So by the time we got there and Kosovo had been on, we were up in the 5th place. Extremely rare. Where is it? It's on the equator, practically. It's on the date line, and it's a long way from everywhere. Fish and Wildlife describes it as a coral crest on top of a volcano. And in fact, we saw volcanic shale all around the island as we toured the place. It was discovered by whalers in the early 1800s. They named one island after the ship, and Baker was named after the captain. In the mid-1800s, the United States was claiming ownership of a number of islands under what they call the Guano Act. And trust me, Baker still has tons of guano. Military was there in the 1940s. As you'll see in a couple of slides, there was also some attempts to colonize this place. I have no idea why. Treeless, there's scrub vegetation around to hide some of the crabs. They say it never rains. We disagree with that assessment. And there is a huge bird population, estimated at 7 million at the minimum and 11 million at the maximum. In 1974, it became a wildlife sanctuary, and as a refuge, visitation became extremely limited. Its distance from the world Population centers also makes it limited. And in 2014, a lot of the DX entities, you know, were merged into one large reserve called the National Monument of the Pacific Remote Islands. And you'll see Wake and Johnston, Palmyra, Jarvis, and of course Baker Howland. When we did get permission to go, we knew it was going to fall during an anniversary date of Amelia Earhart, so we dedicated the expedition to her. She was headed for Baker and Howland Islands. They now believe she actually was a little further south, and I'll get to that in a minute. Also in the mid-1930s, a group of Hawaiian students and young men were recruited to colonize Baker and Howland Islands. And throughout the slides, you'll see some remains of the settlement. They were actually bombed by the Japanese on the way back from Pearl Harbor. And in fact, 2 of the students died, and there are gravestones from both the guano expeditions and the students on the island. One of the reasons we think we got our license is we put together a team of people who had been on fish and wildlife locations. Most of the team was with me on K4M on Midway. One of the persons assigning the license was Matt Brown, who was the administrator on Midway when we were there in 2009. So he knew about half the team personally. Some of the team had also been to Wake, Palmyra, and the Navassa and Desecheo DXpeditions. So we were known to Fish and Wildlife. It still took us 3 years to get a permit. Getting a permit has a lot of things that drive up the cost of a DXpedition. We had to have the boat inspected at a U.S. port. The boat had to be approved by Fish and Wildlife. We got a 1-year permit in September, and it was subject to the availability of a biologist from Fish and Wildlife going with us. None was available until early 2018, but that was the heart of the hurricane season. And the boats we all contacted that were acceptable to Fish and Wildlife wouldn't leave port until the beginning of June. And that drove our decision to go in June, which may not have been the most advantageous for low-band work, especially with Europe, but it was what our permit allowed, and the permit was expiring in August, so September it was. And in fact, we were arguing with the ship, trying to think, can you go a little earlier? And Rob was adamant, and in fact, in late May of this year, one of the worst hurricanes to ever hit that part of the ocean happened. So always trust your captain, they say. All our clothes had to be frozen. All our clothes had to be new that was going to the island. I'll still never forget my wife opening the freezer top to bottom with everything I needed to go to Baker. The things you remember, right? We weren't allowed to eat tomatoes or anything with live seeds up to a week before we got to the island to protect the diversity. Because the AH-1A actually got stranded because of the high tide and reef problems, they required us to have 7 days of food and water on the island. They limited us to 11 operators at night, which meant with a 14-man crew, we were thinking of remote operation from the ship for those 3 people that were being moved back and forth, and we'll get into that in a minute. Vertical antennas, 43 feet maximum. That means you have to engineer better. Doesn't mean you ignore any of the bands. No fishing, no swimming, no making a movie without permission. We had a special use permit that said we were going for ham radio. If we wanted to do anything else, including calling it a commemorative DXpedition, we had to have it written into our special use permission from Fish and Wildlife, and there was a $20,000 fee to the Department of Interior to pay for the expenses of Fish and Wildlife in allowing us to go. Because we had to leave from a port where it could be inspected by the U.S. Coast Guard, that meant we were 1,900 nautical miles from Hawaii or 1,100 from American Samoa. So we chose American Samoa. We then went looking for the ship. We wanted a ship that had been there, done that, had a crew we could rely on. 9V1YC and K6TD went to Fiji before we signed the contract and checked out the crew, the team, the boat. They knew what they were doing. They had been in the area half a dozen times looking for Amelia Earhart. So they knew where they were going. They'd been there. This wasn't a maiden voyage, and it was expensive, but we were successful doing it. That is what the Naya looks like. It's a live-aboard dive boat. The speed was 9 knots. We actually got to 10 several times. Braveheart could never have done that. Lots of sleeping quarters. You'll see some of the bunks later. It was quite luxurious. Good food. Excellent reputation. Fish and Wildlife loved it. Last spring, we put together all the stations. We assembled the tents. These are the same tents we used on VP8ORK with different toppings. Nothing could be used in terms of materials, so we bought new covers. 5,800 pounds of freight, which was air freighted to Fiji on June 1. Everything arrived fine. Because we were thinking of remote operation from the boat, NET AA7A laid out quite an elaborate system of networking. Every radio was accessible from the boat. We had a 900 megahertz link. We used K3s and K30s. Worked fine on land. It did not work from the rockiness of the ship to land, so there was no remote operation. The IOTA people were very happy to hear that. This is what the software load looked like, mostly because of the desire to network, the use of 2 stations on FT8, and 2 computers that were on the boat. We used the Nooks, just like Tim uses in his contest station. Dependable. They didn't seem to mind the heat. None of the radios minded the heat. It was about an average of 120 degrees during the day there. This was what our itinerary looked like before we went. The ship would sail deadheaded to Fiji, where we would meet it. From Fiji to American Samoa, where we would meet it. Then on to Baker, 10 days on Baker, and then a 6-day voyage back to Fiji. We assembled on the 19th of June, had a team meeting. Everybody was assigned specific tasks once we got to the island. We didn't want to waste a lot of time setting up, so we split up into teams. The ship was involved in all our planning meetings on American Samoa, so they could assist us. And first night aboard, the Naya family took us in. Every night we were entertained. Very musical group. They were surprised that we wanted to stay on the island and not come back every night for the concerts. Here's the crew. Rob in the lower corner there, like I said, has been searching for Amelia Earhart for the last 20 years. His father was head of Fish and Wildlife in Hawaii, so he knew the requirements we were under. They did nothing to jeopardize our mission by fishing illegally or diving illegally or doing anything that wasn't on our permit. It was an excellent crew. Here's the galley. There's lasagna being made for our first meal. Here we are eating our first meal. Unlike most of the DXpedition tapes you see on the Braveheart or some of the other ships like the Machias. And here we are leaving port on daybreak on the 20th. A couple of shots on the way. We did FT8 Maritime Mobile, which gave a chance for those crew members that hadn't used FT8 to learn it. Seas weren't too bad. A couple of the crew was sick. On the way, we passed Nikomororo Island. It's in the T3 group. They knew we were coming. The British military had been on Nikomororo, and they had found a skeleton of a woman, which a couple of years ago they announced was the right weight, size, race of a woman of Amelia Earhart's age. They found other evidence of somebody being on the island. Remember, it's not inhabited. And they found this stuff in 1940. They believe, based on flyovers, that if you look at this patch off the forest, okay, this one. Oh, now it's working. There you go. They believe they mistook it at night for a large sandy beach or even the runway on Howland, and that's where they crashed. Rob wanted to dive because there's a piece of debris that looks like a wheel in the water here, and at the very last minute, the T-30 people said, "Great, you can dive, come and pick us up and we'll monitor it." And of course that was 2 days out of our way. So all our good intentions of diving for a relic from Amelia Earhart will be left to somebody else. Here we are crossing the equator. Started seeing birds. And on the morning of the 25th, almost a day early than we anticipated, here I am with Tomy HA5RY on the front of the ship, seeing Baker for the first time. Took us 3 years to get here. The island sent out a welcoming party. Had a quick breakfast, and just after daybreak, sunrise, we went off to the island. It was already probably in the 80s. Here we are on the beach, supplies coming across. The captain had talked to Noah, who had been to the island in the past year. We had been warned that the reef was impassable. It wasn't. You just had to be prepared for it. Rob bought this yellow boat, which had a steel bottom. And this is how we got on the island. Wait for a wave. Gun it. If you look carefully, in a few seconds, you'll see fish swimming around the boat. Right there. So you ride the wave in, you hop out, you spin it around, and wait for the next wave to push it up on the beach. "20-odd trips in, 20-odd trips out." The Fijians carried all the really heavy boxes. Remember, there were 3 tons of this stuff. Allie was our biologist, signed by Fish and Wildlife. And Wonder Woman she helped us put up the tents. She helped put up antennas. She was a full part of the team. At very high tide, they could even use the larger of the skiffs we had with us and then float the equipment to the island. We decided to set up on the western part where the waves were less, where we could get over the reef. We put sideband in the middle with the servers and the eating tent, CW all the way on the northern part of the island for the best takeoff, and digital was on the southern end. Digital played a much more important role in our DXpedition than we had planned. So here's the lighthouse. It's really a day beacon because there's no light in it. All the way in the north, we had 3 stations in the CW tent. There's the headquarter tent, 3 more stations in sideband, and 2 in the RIDI tent. CW, we had a 43-foot vertical for 160, but we fattened it by running loading wires down 2 of the guy wires and then back into a control box and tuner. We did the same thing on 80, and that antenna also worked all the way down to 10. We had a big IR, a small IR, and we had VDAs, which were 43-foot verticals, and on both sides, again, just like the 160 antenna, loading wires going down the guys. They worked extremely well. Sideband, again, big IRs and a VDA, and RIDI tent, we had a vertical for 6 meters, a 3-element vertical. We also had a big IR and a small IR. Closer view of the tents in the center. That's how spacious and roomy they were inside. As I mentioned, the team had its meals cooked by the Naya and brought to shore, and they were surprised that we wanted to eat at our radios. Never seen a group like this that just wanted to sit in hot little tents. Here we are putting together one of the big IRs. That's at the CW site. Small IR. The 160 antenna, that was our northernmost antenna. These are 2 DHDL loops that we erected, one aimed at the US and Europe and the other one aimed at Japan. All the CW antennas. This is a better description of the vertical dipole array we had on 17 and 20 meters. We had 2 stations of the 8 that only operated on 20 meters. We made a decision to go for maximum unique calls, and the way to do that is never leave 20 meters. And 20 meters stayed open pretty late into the night, and it was the first band to open in the morning, other than the low bands, of course. Here's our 3-element vertical 6-meter radio. We beaconed for 2 straight days, never worked a soul, and decided that station would be much more productive on the higher bands. Better view of the beach. This is the Baker Hilton. That's where we slept. At night, if the wind would drop, you began to smell the guano. So while you don't want a lot of wind on an island, we prayed for it every night before going to bed. Sand was everywhere. We experimented with putting buckets of water out that you could wash your feet, but all that meant is you dragged water into the tent, which created other problems because the wind would blow in the sand and then you'd have mud. So there was just no way to deal with it. Here's Allie's executive suite. So, latrine digging. We asked the Naya with fish and wildlife specs. Yes, they have specs on new latrines. If you look at that little blue thing down in the corner, it had to be painted. No bare wood on the island. When we're on the boat and we're looking at the latrine they built, it was 6 feet tall. Now, Fijians are tall, but even a 6-foot toilet is a little much. But they dug the hole and then they built it up with stones when they realized just how tall they had constructed this. And that was that was the facility out in the hot sun that you used for 10 days. That was the shower. The water was heated by solar, but most people just filled these little things and took cold showers, because the last thing you want on Baker is a hot shower. My KN4EI took care of all the generators. Here's a better shot of Baker Power and Light. And you see the bird there. It's a masked booby, immature. When we set up the generators for the RTTY tent, he wandered over. And for 10 days, he would not leave those generators. We tried to shoo him away. Not sure if it was the fumes, the hum, but he called it home. We just couldn't move. And you see the berms that the generators were in again. Leave nothing on the island, prevent spills. Here's one of the typical 8 stations on the island. You can see the controller for the stepper, KPA 500s, K3 radios, the Nook computers, you see the front. After a day and a half, we made it on the air. We were on the air for about 6 hours, and we found out that the claim that it never rains on Baker was false. A giant storm came in. I remember looking out at the ship, and it was gone. It was supposed to stay anchored right offshore, but they saw the system coming in. They went out so they wouldn't get caught on the reef, and it blew down all our antennas. So day 3 started with repairing things. When we finally, after 2 days, had all CW and sideband up, it took the 3rd day to get RTTY up. We were on 31 band modes. Doesn't provide a lot of solace for some of you on the western slopes of Europe. We also had the polar path to deal with to get to you. Here I am with Kevin, team leaders. Some of the crew, Bud, Arnie, you all know Arnie, he's been everywhere. Neo VA4DX, another veteran of many of our DXpeditions, AA7JV. He went there to work top band. He and I were and Tommy were the only top band operators. We put, mostly George, put 1,700 Qs on top band in the log. 9V1YC, you all know James. Here's Tommy. Ken, we brought along Ken to work the massive JA pileups, which he did. One day he was at the radio for like 18 hours. Here he is at night. Here's the team at night. Kevin and his pillow. Again, the 6-meter beacon. FT8's a great mode to beacon. We had RTTY and FT8 operators next to it so we'd know if anybody answered. And by the beginning of day 5, we knew that we were wasting a radio. This is the DigiPalace. You can see FT8 there, and you can see RTTY on the screen on the right. The best rates on RTTY on a DXpedition are 80 or 90 per hour. If you put one operator operating both FT8 stations, or 2 ops doing FT8, you can easily achieve 300 per hour. So after 2 days of RTTY, that went by the board. And RTTY is not an easy mode in a pileup situation. FT8 is. Here I am on both 20 and 17, and here's what that looks like. Click some of the Q on the left, click some of the Q on the right, wait for it to work down, and repeat. And we didn't take anybody off CW or sideband shifts to work FT8. You could do a 4-hour shift working Italians on 20 sideband and go relax by working FT8 and not feel the need to run out in the water and scream your head off. Here's what the screens look like. So you have incoming calls as a Fox, where you can choose who you want to work. And you learn quickly who's using the wrong software so you don't choose them again, because not everybody got the message that there was a Fox Hound mode. We worked with Joe Taylor on this. The KH7 team, KH7Z team, had 3 on-air testings of the FT8 software before it was released. We used N1MM. It was all integrated. There's the waterfall, as you can see, off of the FT8. We added frequencies to our band plan that took us off the RTTY frequencies and also took us off the normal FT8 frequencies as sort of a hint that if we were on these other frequencies, we weren't operating normal FT8. People still didn't get the message. They did after a while when all their friends were working us and they weren't. The VP6D team and the Z23 team are both using our frequencies that we used on KH1, so we think those frequencies will be the Fox-Hound mode frequencies. It was amazing how many people hadn't synced their clocks, and we could always tell if you were calling us below 1,000 hertz up that you were using the wrong software. We kept putting out press releases. The pilots kept telling people, if you're transmitting below 1,000 calling us, you're on the wrong software. What did FT8 do? In addition to providing a lot of cues in our off hours, we were working a lot of people who weren't used to working top 10 DXpeditions. We got a lot of emails after we were back from stations, including some in England, saying, didn't have a big antenna, didn't have a big linear, but wow, I actually worked a rare one. Cheryl wrote that she worked us on 3 bands from an indoor antenna using 100 watts. And there were a lot of Cheryls out there. This is the Chinese radar on 60 meters. It was also prevalent on 20 and 30 and 40. And when the Chinese radar went on and you were on sideband, you could just get up and go for a walk. If you listened carefully, you could hear the tones of FT8 in that, and it decoded all the time. So this was one mode. CW also could work over some of the Chinese radar, but FT8 always did. When we got back, I had a series of emails with OE7 MPI who said, I know I worked you. I got an RR73. He said, you wouldn't have sent an RR73 if... And so I looked in our all file that FT8 generates and couldn't find them anywhere. And I was looking at this picture and it dawned on me, if you look at the red arrow, whoever was pirating us forgot to change his grid square, which was KH7Z. That's in downtown Moscow. So that explained July 4th all the stations that never worked us. As I said, a lot of people worked us once, and only once on FT8, including 9 stations in England. 887 uniques were only on 20 meters FT8. So if you have a why use it, and why did we use it more and more as the expedition went on? Poor sunspots, poor bands. RTTY was slow, but FT8 was fast. Lots of people who didn't have top-notch stations made it in the log. You couldn't DQRM us. You could tell if it was a pirate if he didn't stay on for hour after hour. Most of the pirates come and go. We did post logs daily, so even if you worked an FT8 pilot, that should have been a clue. Counts for digital. And it's bringing more people in the hobby. I know some people don't like FT8, but we got an awful lot of emails from people who had never worked the top 10 DXpedition. We worked more CW stations than we did FT8. We never took one station off of CW to work FT8. In fact, we added 2 stations. I think it's going to be a positive thing until we get some sunspots back. Even Allie got in the act of working FT8. She says she's going to get a license, which is good because she goes to Johnston all the time. And a couple of quick pictures of sleeping during the day. Here are some of the never rain events. That's the sign when we got there. That's what it looked like after the crew of the ship rebuilt it. We had operators from these countries, and Australia and Scotland were the crew members. Heil gave us headsets. Every morning we had a team meeting. We got feedback from the pilots. From the pilots, they were reporting back if we missed any openings, where people wanted us more, requests for this, requests for that. And here are some pictures of this beautiful island. It's the old World War II Loran site. 100-foot poles, but they were 80 years old, so none of us wanted to climb them. Some of the settlement remains. That's from the Guano settlement, the 1800s. There are some of the gravestones from Meyerton, which was when the Hawaiian students were there. That's a Guano period anchor. And everywhere you look, birds everywhere, and in fact some military gear that was left to rot. An old crane, bulldozer. We're not sure what that was, but I took it out for a ride one afternoon. Birds. Birds, birds, and more birds. That's Ken, JN1THL. Those are sooty terns. Most of the island has sooty terns. They're the most prevalent bird, and there's about 7 million of them, as I said. There are tropical...
A few tropic birds in
Yep.
there as well.
Yeah, tropical birds, frigates. Frigates normally live in big trees. They were there on the ground nesting. That's the second one in the top. All sorts of boobies and terns. Beautiful sunsets. First night there was a full moon. First night of operating. Here's the beacon, day beacon. And that's what happens during the day. The crabs find shelter. It's the only place. Fills up. We were told we couldn't go near the wildlife, but they kept coming to us. And one night, Allie started writing names on them and having races in the master tent. You do what you do when you're bored. We were supposed to stay till July 6th, but on the morning of July 4th, the captain came to us and said, there's a huge storm building just east of here. It's coming this way. You can leave tomorrow, or you risk being stuck for 3 days, and after 9 days, we were ready. It took us over 2 days to set up. It took us 6 hours to tear down. Here we are getting ready to go off the beach, waiting for the rides back to the boat. We were all pretty exhausted by then. That's what you look like 10 days in 120-degree weather. This is what all the equipment looked like back on board. The crew of the Naya also walked the entire island and picked up all the debris they found. And we headed out ahead of the storm. Baker has a lot of bottlenose dolphins, and they escorted us out. This went on for like 30 minutes. It was fascinating. We couldn't fish in the reserve, but we could fish on the way back. We caught a lot of mahi-mahi, including this giant barracuda. Team slept. Here's some of the accommodations. It's the dining room, downstairs hallway. Every room had its own toilet and sink. Pretty nice, huh? That's why the boat couldn't understand why we wanted to sleep on the island. And again, just as the first night on the island, we got back to Fiji and so here we are, got to the island June 25th, a day ahead. We actually got back to Fiji right on time. Immigration came on board. We weren't allowed off until they had breakfast. Took a day and a half to load the boat. It took about 4 hours to unload the boat. Funny how things work that way. So where did the money come from? We spent close to $500,000 on this venture. North America, as it usually does, was 77% of the non-team funding. Europe was 13%. Asia was 9%. Half the money came from the team, as it should. Foundations were a quarter, and individuals, this includes all the OQRS money up until about a week ago. We said we'd stay on 20 meters. In fact, we made sure of it by having 2 stations that could only operate 20 meters. That was 40% of our queues. CW was 47% of our queues, still the go-to mode. Sideband was a little over a quarter. FT8 was a little under a quarter. RTTY was 1%. Daily, our peak day was June 30th. At one point, we had all 8 stations on. When you have 14 operators, that's a feat. We made just close to 11,000 queues that day. Close to 70,000 queues. If you had told us we were going in June and we'd make that many queues at the bottom of the cycle, I would have thought about it. Paul, N6PSC, wrote in his blog, we were always on the air. He doesn't understand when we took bio breaks, and the answer is there was too much fun on the radio, so who needs them? Also, you saw what the latrine looked like. One of the team members did an analysis of where our unique total should be based on what other big DXpeditions did. We're right there in the middle. 18,000. We worked more uniques in Europe than we did in Asia, even though it was a much greater distance. Of course, there's a bigger population here. But nevertheless, we stayed on 20. We don't think we missed any 20-meter openings. We were there for new ones, and each listing of KH1 on Club Log drives it down further as people get their QSLs. Worked 149 DXCC entities. 17% of our queues were from Europe. Again, Europe on 20 meters was 90-odd% of our queues. More CW to Europe than any other mode. 243 uniques with the G and EI stations. 440 band modes. 9 uniques, as I mentioned earlier. But here's a good statistic. European foundations were not a big contributor to us, but the British foundations were 40% of the clubs and foundations from Europe. So hats off, guys. Also, 3% of our money came from the UK, with individuals mixed in. And trust me, the UK hams were not 3% of our total, not even close. So you guys stepped up, thank you. Here are the pilots, or pirates, depending on what day I say it. Fish and Wildlife, we thank for the permission. NCDXF gave a $75,000 grant. That was more than all the other clubs and foundations together. Elecraft for the radios. DX Engineering, Tim's here. We asked if he would help. He just basically said, send a list. We sent a huge list. We got a lot of supplies from DX Engineering. CDXC and the RSGB DX Fund buy raffle tickets. Here's the QSL card that's out in the mail now. Hopefully you all have yours. And that's it. Questions? Thank you. Do we have time for questions?